We come to a major transition point in 1 Peter tonight. Chapter 3, verse 13 through the end of the letter deals with the Christian attitude, or the proper Christian attitude toward hostility. And tonight we'll be looking at the first part of that. We'll be looking through the 22nd verse here in chapter 3. And one of the things we'll be dealing with in the latter part of this passage is what may be the most difficult to interpret scripture passage in the New Testament. It is something that scholars argue about and are divided on. And I'm not going to pretend to give you the final word, but I'll give you at least a sense of what the options are in interpreting this very obscure passage. But the first part of it is a lot more straightforward, but can be a bit of a problem for modern day Christians because Peter was writing to people in a very different setting than our own. Folks don't write letters much anymore. Email and text messages, Twitter pretty much taken the place of letter writing. But a few decades ago, people wrote a lot of letters. And I don't know if it has ever happened to you, but occasionally people have been known to get a letter and open it without looking and suddenly realize they're reading somebody else's mail. And it's one thing when you're reading, an ad that was sent to somebody else, but if it's a personal letter, feels kind of strange. It's almost like being a voyeur. You're looking in on stuff you're not supposed to see. And what's more, it may not have much meaning to you if it's somebody else's letter. What would apply to the intended recipient may not make near as much sense or be nearly as applicable to somebody reading it secondhand. Peter, in his letter, was writing to people in a very specific context. It was a context in which they were facing persecution. Peter was writing to people who were facing sharp hostility from their employers, from their neighbors, from people at large, possibly even from government officials. We don't face that kind of persecution here today. Now, there are many places in the world where it is a daily reality, but thankfully for us today it is not. But even though we may not face this kind of persecution, there's still a message to be found in this passage for us. Now, some folks, in order to find that point of applicability, will exaggerate or twist their own perception of what they're going through to convince themselves that, yeah, I'm feeling persecuted too. In an attempt to make the letter a little more meaningful to them. So I don't encourage that, because I've known some folks who have endured real persecution, and nothing that we face here remotely qualifies. We may get harassed, we may get hassled, we may get embarrassed. In some circumstances, people may get passed up for promotion because of their faith, but the kind of stuff that truly qualifies as persecution, we are protected by law from that in this country. Situation for Christians may not be as cozy as it was in the 50s, but it's still a far cry from persecution. Nonetheless, what he says to Christians who are actively and vigorously attacked for their faith. Much of this also applies to those whose Christianity is just ignored or quietly tolerated. Some of the same principles apply. And the fundamental instruction for us is that we are expected to maintain the highest standards of Christian living regardless of circumstances, and to seize every opportunity for a positive witness regardless of circumstances. So, as I said, the last major section of the letter begins here in verse 13. From this point onward, Peter is concerned principally with Christians' response to actual persecution. And the focus shifts to actual response to specific attacks. In verses 13 through 17, Peter urges his readers to make positive use of opportunities that are posed by hostile situations. In this, he reinforces his teaching earlier in the letter by making reference to Jesus' suffering on the cross in verses 18 through 22. And then we get into this really difficult to interpret passage that begins in verse 19, and we'll get to that in a few moments. Verses 13 through 17, you could entitle this "The Blessings and Opportunities of the Persecuted." Nobody likes pain, unless you've got some major deviance in your personality. You don't seek out physical hurt. The fear of physical pain is a instinctive and strong one in most of us. Anybody here really enjoy going to the dentist? Does anybody here have a real phobia about going to the dentist that they'd admit to in public? Okay.
Yes, I don't like hands in my mouth.
You know, if my early experience with the dentist had been as painless as my more recent ones, I probably wouldn't bother me at all. I mean, now before they even give you the shot to deaden the serious pain, they'll wipe a little swab on there to deaden the feeling of the needle. So it's, you know, it's a pretty painless endeavor now. But my gosh, when I was a kid, at least they gave me Novocaine, but the getting of the Novocaine was bad enough. And they'd stick that big needle in your mouth. You know, felt like somebody hit me in the head. So we know how to respond to pain. You know, we avoid it. And it's not just physical pain we avoid. We avoid emotional pain. We avoid social pain. In fact, some of these other kinds of pains can be just as traumatic for us as physical pain. To be the object of ridicule among a social group that is important to you can be incredibly painful. In fact, you know, we've heard all kinds of terrible stories about particularly young adolescent teenage girls who, because of bullying on social sites like Facebook, have actually killed themselves. So we try to avoid pain. And one of the challenges of our Christian faith is that when we are faithful as witnesses to Christ, sometimes the response to those that we are trying to share this most important thing in our life with is one of ostracizing us. You know, they ridicule, they avoid, they make fun of, and that is painful. Peter didn't have to explain to his readers what suffering for Jesus was all about. They had already experienced it. What he had to emphasize was the importance that they not repay evil with evil or insult with insult. He referred to situations they'd already felt, that had already arisen. The taste of opposition was enough for them to fear the future. You know, once you've been burned, you're much less willing to venture into a situation where you may get hurt again. And so he's trying to encourage those who've already suffered to be willing to go willingly back into situations that may cause them to suffer again. Peter begins this section by taking up the basic question, what will happen to us if we live as Christians? Now, who is there to harm you if you are zealous for what is good? But even if you should suffer for righteousness' sake, you will be blessed. Have no fear of them, nor be troubled. But in your hearts honor Christ the Lord as holy, always being prepared to make a defense to anyone who asks you for a reason for the hope that is in you. Yet do it with gentleness and respect, having a good conscience, so that when you are slandered, those who revile your good behavior in Christ may be put to shame. For it is better to suffer for doing good, if that should be God's will, than for doing evil. Mark, would you turn that air conditioning up? I think we're getting more cold air in here than we probably need. I see people beginning to hunker down and shiver. Be eager to do good. That's the message of verse 13. On the whole, Christians are not so likely to suffer. On the whole, as Christians, our behavior in many cases will help to avoid suffering. People who suffer most are those who do wrong and they suffer the penalty of the evil that they're inflicting on others. I mean, crime statistics bear this out. The people most likely to suffer violent crime are violent criminals. You know, you look at the folks who are most likely to be victims of crime, and there's a disproportionate number of them who are themselves engaged in criminal activity. So this, we can see this, by looking at FBI crime statistics. People who are nice, who are polite, who do the job that they're hired to do in a timely fashion, in a good way, who treat others like they want to be treated themselves. Just by living good, upright lives, you can avoid a lot of pain in your life. It's the people in the workplace who chronically come in late, who don't do their assigned jobs, who are surly and disrespectful to their supervisors, who treat their subordinates cruelly. These are the folks who end up, in most cases, suffering the worst because they bring it on themselves. As parents, we see this with our kids. When they behave themselves and do what they're told, we treat them nice. When they are disrespectful and surly and disobedient, we punish them. Same principle applies. But sometimes as Christians, simply because we are Christians, we will suffer. Doing good, as Peter is describing it, means to follow the Christian way of life, as he's already laid it out earlier in the letter. And this is a lifestyle that, in many respects, conformed with the highest standards of pagan morality in the first century. The virtues that Christianity espouses are not unique. You can read the writings of the Greek philosophers, of Plato, Aristotle. You can read the writings of the Roman philosophers. And many of the values that they upheld as good and supportive of a good society were very similar, if not identical, to many basic Christian values. The so it's, don't fall prey to the notion that only the Christian teachings represent good moral living. Again, there's much in other religions and in paganism that is virtuous. Peter goes on to say our way of life is good behavior in Christ, which means that our submission to his rule and imitation to his example, it should be the source that motivates us, that directs us, and in that process, there are going to be aspects of our character, aspects of our values and behavior that are going to stand out as different from those of the unbelieving world around us. So far as Christian morality is in harmony with worldly values, it will be recognized and approved. But there comes a point where there is a divide. Now you look at our own nation. I mean, the United States is the only country I've ever lived in. I've visited a number of other places, but I've never been out of the States more than a couple weeks at a time. So American values, American culture, that's what I know. And much of it has its roots in Christian moral values. This didn't happen by accident. And so it shouldn't be surprising that there is much about American cultural values that are very compatible with Christian moral values. But they are not identical. Every rule has an exception. And just because good, virtuous living, generally speaking, leads to a good result, doesn't mean it always will. And sometimes doing good may lead to circumstances that are openly hostile. Everybody here is old enough to remember when the AIDS epidemic first hit in the early 80s. And the fear and the confusion and the misinformation that was so widespread. People were terrified that casual contact would spread it. And there were kids who were not allowed to go to school because they'd gotten AIDS through a blood transfusion. But very early on, it became evident that AIDS was primarily transmitted either through using used needles by drug addicts or through direct sexual contact. And a number of Christian civic-minded leaders said, there's a simple solution to this problem. If people would live chaste lives and limit their sexual contact to their marriage partner, this stuff wouldn't be spreading. And if you will recall, some of those who espoused that very accurate, common sense, and very inexpensive solution to a complicated problem were villainized in the media. How dare you suggest that we should limit our personal behavior in such a way? How dare you suggest that my behavior is contributing to the spread of a terrible disease? And those people were being victimized because they were espousing some very simple, straightforward Christian values in the context of a major healthcare crisis in the country. It can happen. It can still happen. It still does happen. Those who suffer for being Christians receive gracious gifts from God. Gifts that more than compensate for the suffering. Blessed are you, Jesus said, when others revile you and persecute you. In verses 14 and 15, he says, even if you should suffer for righteousness' sake, you will be blessed. Have no fear of them or be troubled, but in your hearts honor Christ the Lord as holy. Christians are instructed to take a positive attitude even toward threats that they face. We are to face them without fear, without alarm. The more conscious Christians are of the blessings promised by God to His people, the more they will see suffering in a different way. Instead of being afraid of people, Christians' minds should be dominated by their heavenly Lord. Now, this is all true, but it can be harder, it can be easier to say than to do. We are very easily given over to fear. And it's why Peter goes to so much length to encourage and fortify and strengthen the resolve and the faith of his readers, because they are under the gun. This is not hypothetical for them. It's not theoretical. It is real world. He says to, in your hearts, honor Christ. That could also be translated, hallow Him. It speaks of an inward attitude of obedience to Christ, an attitude that dictates our behavior in the world. So Peter is saying, in the act of honoring Christ, you find the strength that you're going to need in order to be faithful to Him under pressure. He says that we are to be ready to bear witness, even under duress. With this inner motive of obedience to Christ, the Christian should seize the opportunity to witness when it is presented. Now, there may be occasions when, as a Christian, you are directly asked about your Christian commitment. And in context of persecution, that can actually happen in a very formal kind of setting where you're being interrogated by authorities. And they've got you under that glaring light, and they say, "Are you a Christian?" These kind of formal appearances were not the norm, even for the people Peter wrote to. It did happen. But in most cases, what they were dealing with was something much less formal and in some ways more difficult to deal with. It can be easier to speak up for Christ when you're being interrogated for your faith, where it's a situation that is very black and white, than it can be to forthrightly admit your Christian faith in the presence of sophisticated friends whose opinion you value. Those are the situations where we tend to weasel, where we're around people that don't share our values, but for whatever reason, their opinion matters to us. We want their goodwill. Now, it could be something as crass and venial as somebody you're trying to make a deal with in the business world, and you don't want to put them off before they sign the contract. But in most cases, it's not anything quite that superficial. It's just a neighbor, a friend, a coworker. You enjoy their company. They're witty. They're clever. You like visiting with them. You like sharing a meal with them. But you realize that they're coming at life from a very different perspective than you are. You don't share some fundamental values. And somewhere along the way, as you're having a relaxed cup of coffee after a meal together, suddenly something is said or done where that difference is glaring. And you've got to make a social choice. Do you laugh politely at the joke that really is offensive to your Christian values? Do you nod when you shouldn't nod, giving that unspoken assent to an assumption that is actually offensive to your values? Or do you let it be known as graciously and politely as you can, no, I really can't agree with you on that. That simple statement can be an exercise of raw courage in the right setting. Because when you do that, you may well be risking everything in that relationship. I mean, they're not going to go storming out of the room and off, but there's going to be this cold draft that everybody in the room suddenly feels. It's no longer us. It's you and me. There's a divide. There is a separation. It is almost tangible. And what might have been a couple more hours of pleasantry, somebody finds an excuse to leave early, and the next invitation is slow to come, if it comes at all. That kind of social context can represent what it means to bear witness in a context somewhat similar to suffering. It's the kind of thing that every one of us can probably have faced at some time, because it's what happens when, one, you are serious about living the Christian life, and two, you are serious about engaging the unbelieving world at a social level. Now, for the Christian who chooses to live a monastic kind of existence, this isn't a problem. You know, you hide away, you don't interact with unbelievers, no problem. It is only when you, and for the Christian who lives such a worldly life that you can't tell them from the unbelievers around them without a scorecard, they don't have a problem either. It's when you try to be consistent and engaged that the problem is a risk. Peter says we are to be instantly ready. The phrase, ask you to give a reason, was actually a Greek idiom in that day. It meant requiring a legal defense. You know, this is, you know, you're supposed to testify to the facts at this point. And Peter's saying, if someone challenges you about your beliefs or about your behavior and the beliefs that underlie your behavior, you need to be ready to seize that opportunity to share the gospel. Now, implied in this is not only that we should be that we should seize those opportunities, but we need to be ready to speak coherently. It is important that you think through your basic beliefs, that you think through why you do what you do. And a lot of Christians really don't do that. We just kind of go through the motions, and we may be doing the right things, but it's kind of like acting, you know, doing something out of route memorization instead of really thinking through what it is that we believe. If you have a good, mature, well thought out faith, where you think about what you do and why you do it. You know, it's one thing as a little kid, you know, you go to church because mom and dad take you. And when you get a little bit older, you go to church because mom and dad make you. But you don't really think about, why is this a good thing? And for some Christians, they never really think about why it is they do it. They just do it out of habit. As a Christian that is really thoughtful and mature and is going to be effective as a witness, you think about it. You know, why you ask those why questions. Why do we worship? Why do we pray? Why do we give? What is the reason behind it? Why do I believe that Jesus is the Son of God? You know, is it just simply because that's what Mama told me when I was little and I never questioned it? If you have a mature faith, then when that unbelieving friend that you have been building a relationship with, you know, ask you sometime, you know, why do you go to that church? You know, I get up, Sunday morning is the only time of the week I can sleep in. I can't imagine giving that up and getting ready and putting on a suit and going to church on the one day in the week I don't have to do that. How do you answer them? Why is this so important that you will sacrifice some of that precious free time? And so my encouragement to you, and I think I echo what Peter is saying, is think about this in advance so you're not going to get caught flat-footed when the question comes. Christians are to respond with gentleness and respect. Gentleness and respect. The respect is how we relate to God. The gentleness, especially when it's shown to people who are antagonistic, really catches them off, you know, kind of in an awkward place. They don't know how to respond to that. Imagine yourself in a fender bender on the way home. And the other person is clearly and totally at fault. You are a victim of somebody else's negligence or stupidity. And the cars stop, the drivers get out, and the other person is braced to get an earful. And instead, you smile politely, you diffuse the situation, you make it plain that no, I'm not going to hit you. I'm not going to yell at you. I don't have a concealed carry permit. I'm not going to flash a gun. You treat them with gentleness. And it changes the entire situation instantly. When somebody is aggressive with you and critical and challenging and they're making fun of your faith, and instead of responding defensively or meeting sharp comment with another sharp comment, you speak gently, politely. Sometimes, they are so taken back by your response that they find themselves backpedaling and maybe half apologizing for what was a needlessly pointed comment in the first place. The demeanor of Christians when they are under the gun for their faith can change our enemies and our critics ultimately into our friends. This is what Peter's... Now again, this doesn't always work this way. That's why we have martyrs. But it can. And the point is that what we have to remember is that the goal of the Christian suffering persecution is not to get out of the situation of persecution. The goal is not to end the pain. The goal is to bear witness to the one who is persecuting, hopefully with the end of leading them to Christ. And that's where we get off track here. We forget what the goal is. Instead of the goal being make it stop, the goal is how can I use this pain, this difficulty, in a positive way to bring witness to Jesus Christ. Peter again makes the point that it is better to suffer for doing good than for doing evil. If we're going to suffer at all, far better that it be for standing up for Christ than for doing something we shouldn't have done in the first place. Patient endurance of persecution is a very powerful form of Christian witness, and history is replete with examples. During seasons of persecution, the church has known growth and expanded influence because of the powerful testimony of those who are suffering for Christ. Verse 18 and following. For Christ also suffered once for sins, the righteous for the unrighteous, and that he might bring us to God, being put to death in the flesh, but being made alive in the spirit, in which he went and proclaimed to the spirits in prison, because they formerly did not obey when God's patience waited in the days of Noah, while the ark was being prepared, in which a few, that is, 8 persons, were brought safely through water. Baptism, which corresponds to this, now saves you, not as a removal of dirt from the body, but as an appeal to God for a good conscience through the resurrection of Jesus Christ, who has gone into heaven and is at the right hand of God with angels, authorities, powers, having been subjected to him. Verse 18 is pretty straightforward, then it gets kind of weird. You go into a Barnes & Noble, and you go into the religion section, and you just thumb through the titles on the spines of those books, and you're going to find lots and lots of books on astrology and magic and spiritism and the occult, Eastern religions, whole shelf of this absolutely worthless crap. People are fascinated with the supernatural, and with it they have a natural fear of it. In spite of the fact that we live in a secular, scientific, materialistic culture, there is this underbelly of fascination with things spiritual that manifests itself in all kinds of bizarre beliefs and practices. There's a lot of nonsense out there coming under the broad heading of spiritual things. You need only look as far as Oprah Winfrey to find plenty of examples of it. Early Christians lived in a similar society in many ways. A society in which they believed in the existence of spiritual powers, both good and evil. The persecution of Christians was often motivated by people who were followers of spiritual forces that were hostile to Christ and his people. You remember, before Judas betrayed Jesus, it says Satan entered into him. Demon-initiated persecution is a reality. Now, some folks have a real problem. Some Christians deny that. They equate belief in demons and angels and stuff as just a holdover of ancient superstition. Well, I guess if that's superstition, I'm superstitious. Because I believe it is real. Absolutely real. Now, there's a lot of nonsense that is embraced by Christians about these things. So, the fact that I believe that Satan is real doesn't mean that I believe that he's got horns and a tail and cloven hooves and bat wings. And for a lot of people, when they think about Satan, that is exactly the kind of image that comes to mind. I believe that angels are real spiritual beings. I don't believe they have wings like birds. You might sometime do just a study of all the references to angels in the Bible, and you will discover that not once does it say they have wings. Now, there are some creatures that do have wings, but they're cherubim and seraphim. They're not angels. So, a lot of superstition out there. But that doesn't do away with the fact that spiritual forces, both good and evil, are real. Peter talks in this passage about angels, authorities, and powers. And he says they are powers that have been subjected to him. They have been brought under subjection. Remember, as we look at this passage, Peter's main purpose is to encourage his readers to face persecution fearlessly, positively, in the face of what Jesus has done for them. So he's saying, no matter how bad the situation may get between you and your neighbor, or you and your employer, or you and the government official that is harassing you, or you and the dark spiritual forces at work against us, Christ is victorious, no matter who your enemy is. So that's Peter's number one goal in this. Keep that in mind as we dig into this really obscure and difficult passage. He begins by talking about the suffering of Jesus. He died once and for all. He died for our sins. He was the righteous sacrifice comparable to the Passover lamb that had to be without blemish. Because of his death, we are set free from sin. And finally, Peter emphasizes that Christ acted as the righteous one on behalf of unrighteous people. While we were yet sinners, Christ died for us, in other words. He talks about his death and resurrection. These two words are two sides of the same coin. You can't avoid the conclusion that they refer to the death of Jesus and his resurrection. And Christ was put to death in the body, made alive by the Spirit. He died physically. It really happened. He rose from the dead. So all of that, pretty straightforward stuff. I don't think anybody here would argue with it. Then we get to verse 19. Made alive in the Spirit, in which he went and proclaimed to the spirits in prison. The central affirmation in this is that Christ went and preached to spirits in prison who are identified as those who disobeyed long ago in the days of Noah. Again, this is really difficult, obscure stuff. I can only think of one or two other places in the New Testament where you're going to find a passage more challenging to interpret. There are several different approaches. One suggests that Christ went to the place where disobedient supernatural powers are imprisoned. This journey sometimes is referred to as going down to Hades before his resurrection, or up to a prison somewhere in the heavens after his resurrection. Some have argued that Christ went to Hades, the grave, and preached to the spirits of people who were disobedient in Noah's day. So that argument is that the people he's preaching to are dead human beings. Humans that lived thousands of years earlier in the days of Noah and were in Hades awaiting final judgment. There's even a school of thought that suggests that what is really being discussed here is a reference to Christ entering into Noah in some sense and preaching through him to those who rejected Noah's message during the time the ark was being built. I don't think that position has much to commend it. I'm not going to dwell on it much. The real question is, to me, is Christ preaching to the spirits or souls of long dead human beings? Or is he preaching to fallen angels, to spirit creatures, demons, if you would? So, as you look at this, the first question is, where does this happen? Where did Christ go? And there are a couple of very different ideas here. One is that he, in some versions, they say Christ went to hell. Well, that is definitely an inaccurate translation. Hell is not the word. In the New Testament, in the Greek, the word most typically translated hell is the word Gehenna. That is not the word that is used here. And there is another word that can be translated simply the grave. And in Greek it is Hades. In Hebrew it is Sheol. And sometimes these words, people use them synonymous for hell. And there are some contexts in which that's probably accurate, but not in every context, definitely. So, some have argued that between Good Friday and Easter Sunday, Christ descended into the temporary waiting place of the dead, Hades, Sheol, the place where condemned souls await the final resurrection and judgment and punishment as they are cast into the lake of fire. That's one argument. There is another school that suggests that the place where Jesus went was first of all, it was a visit that he made after his resurrection, not before his resurrection. And in connection with his ascension into heaven to the right hand of God. And that on the way, he visited the prison of disobedient spirits that is situated somewhere in the, quote, heavens. Now remember, heaven is a word that has many different meanings in Scripture. The heavens can be the atmosphere where the birds fly around. It can be the abode of God. And it can be, other regions of, above us. Kind of a sort of a vague sort of reference. Bear in mind that the Bible talks about Satan being free to come into the presence of God in heaven until the point where he is cast down to the earth. So the idea that a fallen spirit being could be someplace other than in the earth is certainly a legitimate idea. The notion that the grave, that Hades is in the ground, is something we need to understand as a metaphor anyway. You know, if we were able to drill a well or a hole to the center of the earth, you know, at some point we're not going to break into hell or Hades. You know, thoughtful people have always understood that this is metaphorical language. You know, hell is not literally in the ground any more than heaven is literally in the air. We're talking about a different kind of existence, a different plane of existence. So we use these terms metaphorically, but that doesn't make them less real. It's simply, you know, we're trying to grapple with ideas that are beyond our human realm of experience. And we either have to talk about them metaphorically or not talk about them at all. We talk about angels as having wings to communicate the idea that they are able to travel with great speed. And, you know, before the advent of airplanes, the fastest thing that we humans had ever encountered were birds that could fly fast. And we gave angels wings with bird feathers and demons wings with bats' membranes, not because there's something inherently better about feathers than skin, but because most people like birds better than they like bats. You know, so we use these metaphors to communicate a reality that we can't even talk about other than in metaphors. So, we don't know where Jesus went, is the bottom line, where this place was. But I think the best evidence to me is that the people or the creatures that he was speaking to were not human beings. They were spirit creatures. They were in my best understanding, they were fallen angels. They were the angels that were part of Satan's rebellion. And these were we call them demons, but they're angels. They're angelic creatures. And they were instrumental in leading the human race astray, the events that led up to God's judgment on the earth with the flood and Noah. And what Jesus is doing in this is not an evangelistic mission on Jesus' part. This is a victory parade. And again, think about the context of the letter. Peter is writing to encourage believers who, under pressure, under persecution, that the good guys win in the end. And he's using this dramatic image of Jesus victorious over his mortal enemies after his triumph on the cross. So, in the context, and again, this is my best guess as to what this means. And I am not alone in this. This is not something I just thought up. But there are others who know more about this stuff than I do, that some agree with me and some don't. So this is one of those things where you do the best you can with what you have to work with. My suggestion is that viewing this as fallen spirit beings is the interpretation that most fits the context of this letter. And so I think it makes the most sense. It is most consistent with the basic purpose of what Peter is writing in this letter. So until somebody can persuade me differently, that's my take on it. And I'd ask for questions, but I probably couldn't answer them. Again, there's a few other passages in Jude. There's a real obscure passage. Second Peter's got some tough stuff in it. Obviously, Revelation's got some difficult things, but that's my take on it. Now, one last thing. He talks about this, and then he goes to verse 21, baptism, which corresponds to this, now saves you. So, again, thinking about Peter's whole line of thought and reasoning at this point, he's using this story about the flood and the judgment that came with that, and the fact that Noah and his family was saved through the flood waters because they were on the ark. And he uses this as a launching pad to talk about the significance of baptism. Baptism, which corresponds to this, now saves you. Noah and his family were saved through the waters by being in the ark. This saves you not as a removal of dirt from the body, but as an appeal to God for a good conscience through the resurrection of Jesus Christ. There are those who take this passage and argue that what Peter is teaching here is baptismal regeneration, that we are saved because we are baptized. Well, Peter, the very way he writes this ought to make it clear that that's not what he's talking about. He says, not by removal of dirt from the body. In other words, it's not the water that saves you. Baptism is broadly defined as the entire salvation experience. And baptism is just sort of the outward symbol of the inward reality, which is the source of your salvation. The outward removal of dirt or contamination is not the issue. And again, remember the context. In the first century, for a faithful Jew, to come in physical contact with a Gentile was to leave you unclean. To come in physical contact with a dead body was to leave you unclean. They went to great pains to observe ritual washing. What did Jesus say about them? They were whitewashed tombs. Pretty on the outside, full of contamination on the inside. The outward symbol of baptism is just that. It's an outward symbol. It is the inner change that has taken place, that baptism is the culmination of, that is the important part. And so we finish with chapter 3.